I hope this will be informal. I hope you'll interrupt me, ask questions, tell me what's stupid, make comments as we go. You can save stuff for the end, but you don't have to. And what I'd like to do is go through sort of introduce myself, introduce some of the things I've done that might be of interest to you that could lead this conversation in lots of different directions. So I'll jump into it, but feel free to interrupt and we'll go a different direction. The thing about people who come here and give talks who look like we might possibly be older than you is that we've just had more experiences. It's not that we're smarter, it's not that we have a gift you don't have, it's just we have more experiences, so that's what we always want to make available. So dive in. I founded a design firm called Bowman Design Group. We were an exhibit design firm. So we did trade show exhibits, big sports festivals, science exhibits, aquarium exhibits, museums, corporate briefing centers. We did a lot of work at the Aquarium of the Pacific, which would be the most accessible to those of you who are here. I also later, and I'll talk about why, founded a consulting group called Bowman Change, Inc. And it's primarily to work on environmental and climate change communication and green business strategy. So, one of the cool things about the kind of design career I've had is I've worked for a chunk of time in every place you see a star on that map. And that means I've worked a lot across language barriers with people from all over the world, installing exhibits, leading conferences, giving speeches, stuff like that. And so it has made for a really rich kind of experience that is not what most people think about. I've been a designer, I've been a project manager, script writer for videos and films that are used in exhibitions. I've been an author, I've been a small business owner. That means I've had to be a salesman. I've been the idea guy on projects. I've been an event producer. And I've become a sustainability guy in the business world. So it's a lot of different hats to wear. And that's what I think makes all of this interesting. So not only have I been in all those places, I have found myself on the production line for airplanes more than a few times. I have been on the very top of that trembling power plant tower where you see the arrow. I've been in the oldest hydroelectric power plant in the United States, which is in California, of all places. I've been in the sugarcane fields next to the Everglades in Florida and in the production mill that turns all that sugarcane into sugar. I've been in science labs, corporate boardrooms. I've done a lot of work with NOAA and NASA. I've been in JPL's control room, mission control for the Mars rovers. I've been in the facility where they test the Mars rover. They try to make it as much like Mars as they possibly can. I've worked in art museums. This is the art museum on campus, by the way. Did a project here. I've been behind the scenes in every kind of production facility you can imagine. And I've been behind the scenes with sea otters and penguins. And that's pretty cool, right? My team and I have done logos and marketing collateral materials. We have done interior architecture. That's a museum in Washington, D.C. that we did the architecture for. We've done advertising. This is advertising for that museum, but we've also done, this is kind of fun, fruit flies are more like us than we think because their DNA is almost the same as ours. That's always fun, stuff like that. We've done issue advertising. This is advertising about climate change that was on the metro system in Boston. We did a huge sports festival for the FIFA World Cup in 1994 when it took over the entire LA Convention Center. And we were the lead design team on the whole thing. We were the people who got them to agree to let us put banners up on that tower because they'd never done that before. We've done trade show exhibits. These are a couple of small ones, but we've done the big two-story kind and every other kind you can imagine over the years. We've done air show hospitality chalets. This one's in Paris. at the Paris Air Show, where all the VIPs come in and have lunch and have a drink and watch the air show and schmooze about making business deals. We've done corporate briefing centers. This is the Energy Education Center that Southern California Edison has out in Irwindale, California. And we built a mid-century house inside the facility and took it through a 24-hour day. We've done museum exhibits. This is climate change and DNA and infectious diseases. Lots of them. This graphic we did for the Birch Aquarium down at Scripps Institution of Oceanography. It says, this is a timeline of CO2 in the atmosphere over 650,000 years, and here's where we were in 2006. And it says, for 650,000 years, CO2 in the atmosphere has never been above this line until now. I see that everywhere. I see it credited to NASA, I see it credited to NOAA, I see it credited to different museums. It's really cool that it actually caught on that much. We've done aquarium exhibits. That's a dead whale. It's not really a whale, it's a fake whale, but the fish don't know that. And we did some product design over the years. So it's a lot of stuff, but I have never taken a design class in my life. In fact, the college I went to didn't even offer design classes. And this is where this kind of introduction I want to give you kind of departs from the design world for a few minutes. Because I've always had a peculiar interest in how human beings perceive things. And I'll tell you why in a minute. Because the way we do it isn't always the same. And as designers, you know, if you're doing communication design, which is primarily what I've done, understanding how people might perceive things is crucial, right? Because they're not going to perceive things the way you perceive things, and you have to figure out how to design for the ways that they perceive and think and experience things. And that's a big challenge. It's an intriguing challenge. But if you're doing industrial design and you're going to design a product that people are going to use, it's important to understand how their perceptions work too, so that things fall to hand, things are intuitive, things are comfortable to use, etc. So I think that this is going to be relevant no matter where you are in this game. And I'm going to come at it from an unusual point of view, which you're about to discover. Let's start with eyesight. So the kind of top-level way we think about eyesight is that light comes into our eyes, it gets focused by the lens onto the retina. The retina converts that into little electronic signals that go through our nerves into the visual cortex of our brain, right? Kind of obvious. But when you think about it, what does your brain actually see? It lives, well, here, this is what your brain sees, right? There's no widescreen video, IMAX, panorama in there. There's no light at all inside your head, right? Our eyes are not windows through which our brain sits back and watches the world going by. Instead, our brain is where we're constructing our experiences. Because all the brain ever gets is little zaps of electrical current from our eyes, from our ears, from our skin, the senses in our skin, from our sinuses and noses, from our tongues. And that's how we construct this really vivid experience we call senses. We call eyesight and sound and hearing and taste and all that kind of stuff. And to me, that's really fascinating. Because we don't exactly, I mean, you could say, on the one hand, that those, you know, our brain is like a computer, and so the stuff that comes in is coded, and our brain just receives the code, and it presents to us this kind of experience because it's all coded to do that. And that's true, maybe, but our brain is also where we interpret what all this means, and what we want to make of it, and what we like and dislike about it, and what it means to us. And that's a constructed experience. It doesn't happen on autopilot. And this really becomes interesting for a few reasons. One is that It's in that complete black chamber inside where the special effects departments live inside our skulls, that we decide what to do. We decide what things mean. And sometimes we do things because we follow the herd, right? Everybody follows the herd. Nobody escapes that one. We all follow the flow sometimes. Sometimes we're stuck in a rut and we do things out of habitual experience, right? I always do things the same way. And here's an example of it. If somebody serves you a sandwich, which one looks like a better sandwich? The one that's cut diagonally or the one that's cut square? Right? We have different experiences of things that are that mundane and that simple. And that's a habitual kind of experience. Intrinsically, there's no difference, right? I mean, they could theoretically be exactly the same sandwich. They're cut differently. But when I grew up, man, triangular sandwiches were the cool ones, and the other ones, it's like, damn, I got a bad sandwich today. Right? This is the kind of invented experience I'm talking about. I was once standing in a yellow kitchen with a housemate, and he said, yellow is the color of insanity. But you see yellow everywhere. Everywhere. People paint kitchens and bathrooms and living rooms yellow all over the place. And what's the deal with pink? I mean, some people love it. Love pink. Other people feel nauseated by pink. Right? So what's the deal? That's all happening in here. And this kind of becomes extra interesting when you realize that some people are unable to experience their senses in the same ways. Some people are colorblind. To some people, these look exactly the same. I have a friend who's a painter, artistic painter, and I saw him after a few years, and he was painting everything in black and white, shades of gray. And I said, why did you decide to stop painting in color? And he said, because I showed a painting to my girlfriend, and she says, why is the sky half red and half blue? And I didn't know there was a difference. So he was colorblind. So he wouldn't see certain pairs of colors. And so he adapted to it by painting in black and white. Some of us, and I'm one of them, who spent my whole life being what's called depth blind, meaning I could never see 3D my whole life, until a year ago. And because it turns out there's a kind of vision therapy that can give you three-dimensional eyesight, but all the optometrists don't tell you about that. They're trained that if you don't get it as a child, you'll never get it. So I can talk about it now because I've been on both sides of a divide that most people can never cross, right? If you see the world in 3D, how can you imagine what it's like not to see it in 3D? And if you've never seen it in 3D, you have no idea what 3D is like. I can tell you, it's astonishingly different. So I want to talk a little bit about that, because this has everything to do with how we think about the work we do, I think. So this is what being cross-eyed looks like, or wall-eyed in the case of this person. One of your eyes is looking at the person you're talking to, and the other one's pointing off someplace else. And that was me for my whole life. And when that happens, well, the way vision is supposed to work is that your eyes converge on the same thing. So if I'm looking at one of you, my eyes aim at you, and I get two pictures that line up, but they create this illusion of three-dimensional space, right? But if you only see with one eye, you get two pictures that can't possibly line up. And so you can't have that illusion of three-dimensional space, and what happens is your brain essentially shuts off one eye. Well, it ignores the input from one eye. And in fact, it'll turn it out of the way because it's easier to ignore when it's pointing in a completely different direction. It's less confusing. And so because of that, a person like me who was deafblind, sees out of one eye at a time, can switch eyes. And so it's as if you're seeing, whoops, these arrows go the wrong way. You're seeing this. And when you're a child, it happens without any control. And as you get older, you gain control of it. But whenever you switch eyes, everything moves. And this is one of the ways a person who sees without seeing depth can interpret and figure out where things are. So here's an example. If you were looking at me, I'm standing here. If you were depth blind, you would see me, you'd see the wall behind me, but you would not be able to see the space in between us. And in fact, I might as well be a cardboard cutout. You know, I'm moving. You understand that I'm not a flat cardboard cutout, but you wouldn't be able to, your eyes wouldn't tell you that I'm not a cardboard cutout, right? That's what not seeing depth is kind of like. And so you have to interpret things that way. You have to figure things out that way. And so one of the questions that I always get when I talk about this is this question. How can you design three-dimensional exhibits if you can't see in 3D? And the answer is, well, you design for what you see and what you know, right? When you don't see depth, everything is a graphic design exercise in a way. Because as I move around, the shapes of everything I see change, the light and shadow constantly changes, the way something overlaps something else constantly changes, the shapes reveal themselves the contours of things reveal themselves as you move around. And guess what? There was no such thing as three-dimensional modeling software when I got into design. So we worked in plan, view, and elevation, and sections and details, which means that you constructed the 3D model in your mind's eye, always. It was the only way to do it. And it felt completely natural, because when you're looking at, you know, people used to say, how do you deal with floor plan? It's a graphic design exercise. The floor plan really is a graphic design exercise. So I think it's a really intriguing question, because it turns out it's not hard. Riding a mountain bike's harder. Flying an airplane's probably really dangerous, but doing design isn't really a problem. So one of the curious questions, by the way, a side effect of that is that when somebody first showed me SketchUp and three-dimensional modeling software, all I could think of is, why are you wasting your time on this? Can't you visualize it? Don't you already see what it looks like in your mind's eye? And the answer apparently was no, you know. So as far as I'm concerned, that kind of software investment would be kind of a waste of time. But to other people, it's like the golden tool, right? It lets you experience something in the digital world that you would not experience inside your own mind. And this is a way of just saying that we are not all experiencing the same things in the same ways. And being attentive to this as a designer, I think, is where the money is. I mean, I think this is where the fun stuff is. So, okay, so we've been off the track of design for a minute. And the question, I think, that follows from this is, how did I get into design in the first place? And the truth is, I mean, we're living in a really challenging moment in history, wouldn't you say? You know, our political circumstances are in upheaval like we've never seen. The climate is changing in dramatic ways that's causing fires in Altadena and the Palisades and flooding all over the place, and the polar vortex and all of that. There's a lot going on. And when I think back, though, as I was thinking about what to talk about, I realized that I can't think of a time in my life when it hasn't been like this for very long. I grew up in the 1960s. I was in elementary school and junior high in the 1960s. So a close call, nuclear war close call at the Bay of Pigs in Cuba happened then. The Cold War and the space race happened then. The President of the United States was assassinated. His brother, who was a presidential candidate, was murdered. The greatest nonviolent civil rights leader of several generations was murdered. we grew up on TV watching the violence of the civil rights that led to the civil rights movement in the 60s. Students who were demonstrating against the war in Vietnam were murdered on a college campus in Ohio. And we all knew, all of us growing up, that at age 18 we could be vacuumed up by the Army and possibly never come home. That was the world then, when I was choosing what to do and where to go to college. And it didn't really stop, because once all of that happened, while I was in college, we went through the Watergate crisis and Nixon's resignation. The environmental crisis was revealing itself. Then there was the Iran-Contra scandal, the ozone hole fears, climate change, COVID-19. My nephew works in a lab whose job it is to forecast the risks of AI and try to prevent them from happening. So there's that going on in the background. In other words, upheaval has kind of been the norm in this, in the last half of the 20th century and the first part of the 21st century. So when I was thinking about where to go to college, I actually went to an experimental college that's part of the University of Redlands, east of here. And in its college catalog, the year I went, it showed just a photo of two people leaning against a wall having a conversation, and this was the headline in the center spread: "Learn to make a difference." And that made perfect sense to me, given the times and given what was going on. But when you have quirky vision like I had, and I had a bunch of eye surgeries as a child, and so the ability to move my eyes in a refined way was all messed up. So that made reading really exhausting. And that eliminated about a zillion career paths, because most career paths are all about reading all the time, right? A lot of them are. And so I majored in fine art. And I didn't really know anything about design when I got out of college. And the family business that I grew up in is the clergy. I come from a long line of Presbyterian ministers and college professors and stuff like that. And I knew I didn't want to do that. But through a whole series of events, I found myself in a PhD program in social ethics. And I hung in there for a couple of years and got a master's degree. And it was on the way out that I saw an ad on a job board that led me into the exhibit design industry, doing museum exhibits. And I was like, all of a sudden, I was carrying exhibits in a van back to Missouri to install a nature center. And then I was off to Asia and working across language barriers in Singapore to assemble a complicated exhibit. And then it was Malaysia and Kuala Lumpur, and then it was Jakarta, Indonesia, and then it was Seoul, Korea, and then it was Washington, D.C., and later it was Paris and Farnborough, England, and I was in the corporate boardrooms and on the production lines and all that kind of stuff, and I thought, holy cow, not only are there big budgets to work with, but there are really interesting experiences to be crafted, and there are amazing and interesting people to work with. And that's how that company I was working with exploded when the owner got a divorce and stopped paying attention and lost a bunch of clients. And it was about a year later I started getting calls from our former clients saying, "Will you come help us?" And I sort of found myself in business. And it was in retrospect that I realized how quickly I took to it and what a good fit it was. And it was kind of off to the races from there. So the things that made it interesting to me were that it was constantly new challenges. We were a design office, we weren't a production house. So we would invent things that nobody knew how to produce. And then we would go find people who could produce them. Or we would challenge the shops to do things that were non-standard because they would achieve what we were trying to achieve. And that became just as interesting as working with the corporate executives on trying to figure out how to position themselves and what they wanted to say to the world. So it became sort of interesting at both ends. And we created a small office that had a real family-style vibe, and we took on enormous projects because we were nimble and we were flexible and we were really insatiably curious. And as long as you're curious, you can kind of do anything, I think. So I want to talk a little bit about what I think is actually really important, and you're probably going to think is goofy, and that's fine. And I'm going to start with what I like to call the double thumb experiment. And I want you guys to all try this. Hold up your thumb, like take your right hand thumb, stick it up so that you're looking at it sideways. Hold it maybe 5 or 6 inches in front of you, straight in front of your nose. But don't look at it. Look at me, or look across the room. So it's in your peripheral vision, right? So line it up centered. How many thumbs do you see in your peripheral vision? Anybody? 2, right? Do you realize how nuts that is? I have never seen 2 thumbs until about a year ago. I would see 1 thumb because I was only seeing with 1 eye. And if you, so this really cracks me up. Now, okay, look at those thumbs a little more closely. Which of the 2 thumb images that you see is more thumbnail? And which one is more thumbprint? They're not identical, right? Can you see that? Because one eye is looking from over here, it sees more thumbprint. One eye is looking over here, it sees more thumbnail. To summarize, you see 2 thumbs, neither of which appears to be where it actually is, and you only have one anyway. And the one that has more thumbnail is kind of below the one that has more thumbprint. It makes no sense, but that's normal vision, right? We all accept that that's normal vision. To me, it's an complete illusion, and it's really kind of clever. So, this is even goofier. When I move from side to side, you guys are all moving. Right? Those of you who are in the first rows are moving a lot, and those of you who are in the back rows are moving just a little bit, right? But you're not getting sick to your stomach because you think you're sitting still. But if you watch me move around, the people between you and me look like they're moving too. Right? They're moving left or right as I move back and forth. And we accept this as normal. But it also means, if you really look at goofy things like that, that our perceptions of the world are not exactly what they seem to be, right? We take them for granted. And that might seem like it's a complete non sequitur and doesn't mean anything, but I'm about to show you one of the ways it does. I walked into our design studio one day, and I saw our staff working on drawings of something like this. A filthy, dirty, cluttered garage. Typical residential garage with gardening tools and woodworking tools and mechanical tools and boxes of Christmas ornaments and, you know, suitcases and ladders and stuff that you don't use ever, and your bicycles hanging from the ceiling. And I said, "What are you doing?" They said, "Oh, we got a new project from Southern California Edison. They want you to draw a garage." And they said, "Yeah, they wanted to draw us to design the garage of the future." It's like, okay, what's the garage of the future? They say, well, it's going to have an EV charger in it. And this is long enough ago that the Nissan Leaf was the only EV. You know, Tesla hadn't been invented yet, so they weren't cool. And I scratched my head and said, okay, what's it for? Are they going to a trade show? And I was thinking, it's going to be one of those utility industry, engineering-driven trade shows that are kind of boring, and everybody's got a flow diagram with boxes and arrows and boxes and arrows, you know, it looks like an org chart. And that's what they call communication. And they said, no, they bought a space at the door, outside the front door of the LA Auto Show. And I said, well, let me ask you, does this raise any alarm bells to anybody in this room? Let's put this in context. This is what most people think about when they think about the electricity utility. The lights went out. Damn, I hate those people, right? And the other thing, and they told me this, that they think about when they think about the electric utility is that. And nobody likes that, ever, right? We take for granted that the lights are on, but when the bill comes or the lights go out, we're pissed. That's when we think about Southern California Edison. And this is what we think about when we think about the LA Auto Show, right? Here we are in Southern California, the epitome of car coolness in the United States. And it's where everybody goes to see the concept cars and the new cars revealed, and you get to sit in a car and you get to see the latest Ferraris and Lamborghinis and all that cool stuff. And the assignment, the design brief was design a garage and put an EV charger in it because we're going to make everybody look at it on the way into the show. I love your expression right now. That was exactly my expression. Like, what the? So I asked, who gave you this assignment? Who did you talk to at Edison? Oh, some engineers. It's like, okay. So the engineers see a problem, and that problem seems to be we have to figure out how we put EV chargers in garages. Okay. But, but what about the context? So I called some contacts at Edison and said, what is it you're trying to accomplish at the LA Auto Show? Why are you even going to the LA Auto Show? Nobody thinks about you unless they're pissed off. So why are you going to the LA Auto Show where everybody is more excited than they can stand to go sit in the latest Lamborghini and they don't want anything between them and that, right? Why are you sticking yourself in there? And they said, well, because EVs are becoming a thing and we want to talk to the early adopters and find out who they are so that the early adopters for EVs have a nice experience installing a charger for their EV. And we can make it nice for them because we don't want to poison the well. We want the early adopters to have a nice time so that they can tell everybody else that EVs are cool, so it'll be easier for the next group of people to follow them. And like, what does that have to do with the garage? Right? That's a really smart thing to do, you know? I mean, it's a really clear business objective that had nothing to do with what was in the design brief. And so this was the exhibit. We gave them several options, and this is the one that they chose. And it made perfect sense, right? Because it's an inviting, modern, clean space for having conversations. And the people who are going to have the conversations had iPads, and they were going to walk up to people, and they were going to get there and contact information. They say, if you're thinking about an EV, we'd like to reach out to you and make it easy for you. Completely different from the design brief. And so the question that it really is, what is the design brief really all about, right? And how useful is it? Because it usually isn't. And the question that I asked that client is, why are you doing this? It's the question I always ask every client. Why are you doing this? Wouldn't it be better not to? Prove to me it's worth it. What are you getting out of it that's worth this big expense and this big effort? That's where you start, and they often don't even know. But this is where you start to find out what matters. The second thing is that they might like pink or yellow. They might like yellow kitchens, and you don't know that. So you have to spend some time getting to know who they are one way or another. For example, there's an idea in the exhibit design world anyway, that you start with general concepts, and then you gradually, through the process of design phases and interactions with the client, narrow things down to the specifics, and the final design has all the specifics in it. So we were invited to work on the Koshland Science Museum, a brand new museum for the National Academy of Sciences in Washington, D.C. It's a pretty cool thing to be able to do. And I saw some sketches they were getting from other design firms because they were all upset about them. And they had drawn sketches of tables, sketches of cabinets, and they said, well, you know, as we refine this, you'll give us the science and we'll find a way to put it in here, but we're working from general ideas and we'll work toward the specifics. Scientists don't do that. Scientists work the other way around. Scientists work from data, which is very specific, outward to find what the big concept is. And so in order to communicate with scientists, you have to deal with specifics all the time from day one. And because we understood this, these were our first 2 exhibit design presentations. So, this one is a sliding plasma screen that covers a timeline of CO2 and temperature growth across the 20th century. And this is the greenhouse effect, and it's a copper dome. You can put your hands on it, and one side's cool and one side's warm, because we were going to engineer it to actually do that. This is a comparison of fruit flies and chimpanzees and mice and corn, and how much their DNA is like our DNA. So it was our best attempt to be scientifically accurate. And the funny thing is that the scientists understood it right away. And their comments when we presented it was like, well, this is really good except for all the obvious scientific errors. In other words, yeah, we're not scientists. We don't get it perfect, but we're interpreting real material all the time. And it's not that we're heroes because we had the capacity to do that. The thing that matters is we paid attention to the way they think, to the way they see, to what they're able to perceive. Because if we hadn't, we would have struck out just like all those other firms did. And because we approached it this way, it wasn't long before they gave us the entire project. We did all the exhibits and the architecture and the logo and the ads and all the stuff because we were speaking their language, frankly. And this is really crucial. So these were the initial concepts, and these were the finished exhibits. Exact same 3 finished exhibits. So, I mean, details changed. We had to build them. We had to refine their sizes. And Albert Einstein made his way in there. He wasn't on the first one, but the point of it was that because we understood who they were or we asked how they think, and we were curious about that, we were able to produce exhibits that were where they started. So if somebody told you, for example, design a new toothbrush, we want to redesign the toothbrush, what are some good questions to ask? Do you want it to be pink or yellow? That's one question. But I would start with, does anybody want to throw out some questions? Yeah, please.
What's wrong with your current toothbrush?
That's a good one. So what's the problem with toothbrushes you have? What else? Anything.
Who is it for?
Okay, who's it for? Like, is it the average person? Is it for children? Is it for disabled people? Is it for, yeah, good question. What, any others?
Do you prefer yours electrical or manual?
Do you like manual or electric? That's a good question. Yeah?
What type of material do you want to make it out of?
Okay.
Traditional or non-traditional?
Non-traditional? Sure. Let's do some more psychological questions, though. And you can start with yourself. I always start with myself. What's it like to brush your teeth? How do you feel when you know it's time to go brush your teeth? Are you excited? Are you bummed? Do you try to avoid it? Are you eager to do it? When you have a toothbrush in your mouth, is it a good time, a bad time? What's it like? Why is somebody asked a question, why are you asking us to redesign toothbrushes, right? Yeah, why? Are these dots connecting? Are these various inputs about colors and materials and why they're doing it and what the experience of brushing your teeth is like? Those are the questions. Those are the $64 questions, right? Those are the money questions. Because if you get into those questions with people, you might discover that the project is really a different project than you thought it was when you started. And they might be wanting you to do I can't tell you how many times I've told a client, you're asking us to do A. The problem with A is it's not the problem. The problem is B. I think maybe you want to look at this instead. And sometimes they do. Sometimes we make more money doing that. Sometimes we make less money doing that. Sometimes the project gets canceled. This is a true story. So, one of my first clients was Northrop Corporation. They're an aerospace company. They were one of the companies that the former office I had worked in took care of. And I was in a meeting planning the Dayton Air Show exhibit for Northrop. And I was taken to see one of the three guys on the top floor. He was the senior vice president of corporate communication. And he had to buy off on all these exhibit ideas. So I was sitting with him, and the stealth bomber was going to have its first flight about a week before the Dayton Air Show, and they wanted to make a big deal out of it. So, okay, well, I had designed a big screen in part of the exhibit that would be a theater, and we had big photographs of stuff, and I said, and he was unhappy with the exhibit design, and I could tell, and I didn't know why, and so I said, well, tell me about this movie. They were going to make a movie about the first flight. And he said, well, we have to make a movie about the first flight. It's a contractual obligation. So they're planning the movie. He had a gruff voice. They're planning the movie next door. Let's go. So we go into this corporate boardroom, conference room, right? And the video guy is there, and the vice presidents are all sitting around, and they're planning it. And they said, well, there's going to be a camera at one end of the runway where it takes off, and there's going to be a camera at one end of the runway where it lands, and there's going to be a chase plane with a camera on it. And it's just a document. We're just going to film it. We're going to give it to the Air Force. No big deal. And I said, can I say something? What? I said, you just told me that this is probably the single most important event in the history of your corporation, and you decided to make a boring movie. What's with that? And I described a film I once saw, the 1964 Olympic 100-yard dash, 16 cameras on the 100-yard dash. And I mean, you see the drop of sweat in slow motion coming off someone's head when they're in the starting blocks, and splash on the track. And when the gun goes off, your heart is in your throat, right? And I said, that's the movie you want to make if this event is that important to you. And everybody yelled. And, you know, okay, so got out of the meeting. No, I wasn't dead. Got out of the meeting, went home, and the phone rings, and it's that senior vice president for corporate communication, and he said, you know why I was so pissed? I said, no, why? He said, because you were right, and I was the only one in the room who knew it. The point is, there is an opportunity lying on the table on almost every design project if you ask the right questions and find out what it really is. And that's what makes design fun, I think. So I did this for a long time. 25 years I owned Bowman Design Group. But then I came to a really big pivot that fundamentally changed my career again. And it goes back to this, because I was in La Jolla at the Birch Aquarium designing our second climate science exhibit in 2006. And the Birch Aquarium sits on a bluff overlooking La Jolla Cove. It's absolutely Southern California beachside, pristine, beautiful place. Gorgeous day, the sun's reflecting off the ocean, and it's floor-to-ceiling windows. And I'm sitting there talking with the science curator about the content of the exhibit, and in the course of the conversation I said, the folks at the National Academy of Sciences at the Koshland said, pay attention to the ocean, because water can absorb so much heat before the temperature actually changes that by the time the ocean starts to warm, we're going to be committed to a changing climate for 500 or 1,000 years. And she very casually says, oh, well, we're part of this project that's got 2,500 robotic floats, and we've already measured warming in every ocean basin in the world to a depth of 1,000 meters. Think about that. 75% of the world's surface is already warmed up down to 3,000 feet of depth. That's a lot. And, the word epiphany usually applies to religious experiences where you but the definition is sudden intuitive insight into the reality of something. And in that instant, everything I had ever learned about the impacts of climate change sort of struck me all at the same time. And it literally, my hackles went up. It literally felt like there was a cheetah breathing down my neck. I was shaking. I couldn't breathe. And she said, and by the way, our director wants to meet you now for the first time. So I walk in like a little bit dizzy and shaky into her office and sit down, and when you own your own business, you want to be cool. nothing's a problem. You always are cool. And I could hardly breathe. And she looked at me and she said, is there anything you want to ask me? I said, yeah. How do you cope with knowing what you know? And she said, yeah, okay, now we can get to work. And as I drove home from La Jolla that day, I realized there's no way I can pretend I didn't just learn this, right? I can't put the toothpaste back in that particular tube. And so the more I thought about it, the more I realized I don't know anybody else who does creative communication work who knows as much about climate science as I do. This was in 2006. Lots changed since then, but at that time that was true. So I opened Bowman Change. I brought on my friend to help run Bowman Design Group, and I eventually sold it to him. And I did a whole bunch of different things. The first thing I did is I called all these climate scientists and educators and economists and social scientists and other people I knew, and I said, what if we did a thing like that World Cup project, a festival about climate solutions called the Climate Solutions Project, and we take it on tour to 26 cities around the country. And they said, yeah, we'll be on your advisory board. And we got a grant, and we all met for 3 days, and we planned this huge thing. And then the economy crashed, the Great Recession, and you couldn't raise a dime. So sometimes you win, sometimes you lose, but I had the ear of all these people, and so I knew that one of the problems happening was that the scientists weren't communicating very clearly, because they communicate like scientists, not like the rest of us. And so I got several of them to team up with me, and we published 2 letters in the journal Science, which is a science journal, about how to make their graphs easier for people to understand. I gathered all the social scientists who study public opinion about climate change and interviewed them for 2 days and wrote a report called Toward Consensus on the Climate Communication Challenge. It's like, can we pool all your wisdom and give it to communicators in a way that will help climate communicators do a better job? The Aquarium of the Pacific was commissioned to do a study of climate impacts on Long Beach, and I said to them, okay, but now you need to have a companion guide that everybody can read, that's in English and Spanish, but I mean it's in plain language, and you need to give them hope, so we need to talk about what you can do about it. So that became this, how can you become climate resilient? I decarbonized our company. Turns out it's really easy, but I didn't know that. And we cut our operational emissions by 2/3 in a little over a year, and we won an award from the state of California for it. And I got inducted into the Green Industry Hall of Fame. And I did a podcast for about 2 years. And all of that led to writing 3 books. I had no idea I was going to write books, but the one in the middle I wrote for the exhibit industry about how to do sustainable exhibit practices for trade shows and museums. And then I was asked to write, during COVID, there was a publisher who said, I want to commission a whole series called Resetting Our Future about how we can come out of COVID and solve some of the world's biggest problems. And somebody nominated me to write a book about responding to climate change. And the title of it is, What If Solving the Climate Crisis is Simple? These books are 100 pages long, 120 pages long. They're real short. And then I got involved in a big project with about 150 really diverse people who work on climate resilience and climate change from different angles. Educators, activists, green business people, policy people, a guy from National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, because there is a clause in the Paris Climate Agreement that urges countries to come up with a national strategy to empower all of society to tackle climate change. And no big country has ever done one. I think Ghana did one, and one other country did, but none of the big emitters had done it. And this was when Trump was president the first time, and there was a possibility that Biden would win the election, and that might mean there'd be an administration that cared about this. So all these people came together to write a framework for how to do a national strategy to address climate change. And so I was the lead writer with another really talented person named Deb Morrison, and that turned into a book. And then I was asked to design all the covers for the books in that series. This is 6 of them. So, a little bit of writing, a little bit of design. And that's the logo of the ACE Coalition that led to the book with the red cover. And then I was a co-founder of the Long Beach Sustainable Business Network, which is kind of dormant since COVID, like every other cool thing. That's a lot, right? And I did those books during COVID, which kind of helped me hold my brain together through that experience. And I got into this vision therapy that led to seeing in 3D, and I was working with a mountain bike coach at the same time who was part of a YouTube channel called Joy of Bike. It was about mountain biking when you're over 40 years old, and it was really cool. And I didn't even know about vision therapy as I started working with him as my coach. But I asked him, should we start filming some of the work we're doing, because I don't see depth perception and I want to ride a bike over rocks and roots and try not to go over cliffs? And he said, sure. So we filmed a bunch of stuff. Then I got into vision therapy, and I just finished writing a book about trying to explain the difference between seeing in 3D and seeing in 2D, so parents and their kids and teachers and their kids can learn to understand each other better. Where that's going to lead, I have no idea. It's going to go to the publisher in a couple of weeks, and that says Cross-Eyed Joyride, by the way. That would be the logo for a YouTube channel if I decide to commit myself to making videos every other freaking day. I don't know if I will. We'll see. So just to wrap this up so we can have a conversation, these are the questions that I think matter if you're going to do design for a living. What is it that keeps you interested? It's important to pay attention to that. For me, for a long time, it was, can I create experiences for audiences that are more than they thought they could get? That was an intriguing experience to me, intriguing question to me. And it always kept me interested. Can I figure out how to design something that looks impossible and then figure out how to make it? That's a pretty cool question to me. I like that question. Once I got into climate science, the whole thing shifted, and it was, how can we get people to engage in this issue and vote based on this issue and make purchasing decisions based on this issue and feel hope about this issue? How can we create that kind of psychology? These are really interesting questions, right? And at the moment, a persistent question for me is, how can parents like I had understand their child who has fundamentally different sensory experiences than they had? How can we create bridges between people? So, and then the second question is, what do boundaries and definitions really mean to you? I personally don't think they mean very much. I confront them all the time, but because I was a creative professional who owned my own business, I never fit into anybody else's silo. And so I got to go in and out of their professional silos all the time. I could deal with people in medicine and physics and sustainability and aerospace and natural foods and you name it, and find common ground and put combinations of people together that made sense. To me, that was interesting, right? It's a more diverse kind of a thing, but I kept confronting, I've always confronted people who say, I could never do that. And I always wonder why. It takes risk. You have to take risks. Sometimes you lose. Sometimes, as long as you're willing to learn from your mistakes, the world forgives you. You know, it's not a bad thing. So I think boundaries and definitions are kind of a joke. But that's a question to think about. And then what's design really all about for you? What is the real purpose of taking on this kind of work and these kind of projects? And if the answer isn't a little bit challenging and interesting, then it's just a job. And I don't think we go into creative work because we just want a job. I think we go into it looking for something more. And so, to me, the question that matters is, how do you make it more than that? And with that, I will stop blabbing, and we can talk about any and all of these things that are on your mind.